Hey everyone, welcome to the NDIS Marketing Podcast. My name's Greg, and today we have a very special guest. We're joined by Leigh Hatcher, and Leigh is a veteran in radio and television, having been a reporter and newsreader journalist for Sky News, 2GB, and the Seven Network. He's also the author of 3 books, and one of those being I'm Not Crazy, I'm Just a Little Unwell. And that was about Leigh's battle with CFS. He's also a senior consultant to Hammond Care. Welcome, Leigh.
Greg, it's great to be with you. Thanks very much for the opportunity. I look forward to this conversation, actually. It's one of my great passions.
Yeah, and I'm looking forward to it too, because there's so many people. Last week we actually covered off on video and how NDIS providers can use video. So I thought this would be a great lead in to off that for those that aren't, because a lot of NDIS providers don't know anything about marketing.
Yep.
And so therefore obviously are not very confident in speaking on camera or presenting on camera. So I thought this would be a good lead in as to how a voiceover artist could actually be used for a video.
Too right.
So
right, yeah.
just give us a brief rundown of your career, Leigh.
Well, I worked it out just recently that 50 years ago, this coming November, I walked into the 2GB newsroom as an office boy on day one of me being an office boy. And I had no particular vision or ambition for a career in journalism. All I knew was, my parents watched the Channel 9 news at night and listened to the 2GB radio news. Got a job as an office boy, walked into the newsroom on day one, completely fell in love with it instantly. This was 1973, all those clunky old typewriters bashing away, the clunky old phones going berserk. There were tape spooling, people yelling under the pressure of that hour's deadline. So I was instantly hooked and did whatever I could to appear in the newsroom. I finally got a cadetship 5 months later. Within not even 18 months, I must say I'm continually amazed that I can say this. I had been appointed as the Macquarie Network's chief political correspondent at the ripe old age of 19. And 3 months later, I stood alongside Gough Whitlam on the steps of Parliament House on the day that he was dismissed in that very memorable political earthquake. I then went on to become a news editor locally in Canberra, news director in 5D in Adelaide, all in radio, and then joined Channel 7 for the first time in 1981 as one of their political correspondents back in the press gallery in Canberra. Then went on to become European correspondent for Channel 7, working in London and in and out of East and Western Europe for a couple of years. Came back, did some more radio on 5D in Adelaide. Came back to Sydney, where we were born, my wife and I, with our kids, to work as an on-the-road reporter at Channel 7, a newsreader for Channel 7. Then I lost 2 years of my life, you made mention of it, to chronic fatigue syndrome between 1998 and 2000, and then started with Sky towards the end of 2000 and left them 10 years ago. And since then, I've done that consulting with Hammond Care and worked on the other side of media. So I was always the one in broadcast journalism who was served by people in public affairs, but then I switched to be the server. And I must say I learnt much more than I would have ever imagined about journalism and journalists and how to kind of break through to get your stuff in and on media, be it radio, newspapers or television, than I would ever imagined. And in the coaching that I do these days, I'm a freelance producer, director and presenter of video. I do podcasts for clients and I coach in media training and presentation skills. And in the presentation skills and the media training I do, I dip into that, a lot of that experience. And I've come to kind of reflect on this preparing for our conversation today. What I learnt on the other side of media was a really valuable period of time.
Wow. Some great insights there, Leigh, and a wealth of knowledge. I'm sure our listeners will be able to glean a lot from this discussion today.
Good.
So, why do you think it's important that we speak about the voice?
This has dawned on me relatively late in my broadcasting career, though I've been in broadcasting using my voice and certainly in my media training kind of experience. I'd say this penny really started to drop only about 5 years ago as I was doing my media training. I do lots of presentation skills and media training and came to think, just as I drive to and from some of these workshops and we have discussions within the workshops about elements of presentation. And I started to think, you know what, the voice is really, I've come to think it's actually our most powerful communications tool. I won't do it here because I might give somebody a bit too much of a shock. But in the media training I do, I say the voice is our most powerful communications tool because it is how we basically express everything. And I yell at the top of my voice from anger to sympathy, elation, surprise, boredom. And I do really think on reflection that it is that powerful if you just go and think about it as you have conversations in and on or off media, conversations in meetings, but just in families and wherever. I think that this is I'm onto something here. Your voice is your most powerful communications tool. And I say this as a person who spent 3/4 of his career in television. Yes, using his voice, but it's all about the vision on television. But radio has always been both my first love, which is where I started, but I think my greatest love, actually. And that's because of the voice. I would argue very strongly that radio or podcast, the modern day kind of form of radio, are far more personal and far more powerful. As I can tell you as a former journo, I listen to far more radio than I ever watch television. Roger Clemson, the great Roger Clemson, and I have known each other
one of the great
for many
newsreaders of all time.
many years we've known each other, and we've had lots of conversations. We've been, we've had lots to do with each other, and his career is best known by far for his television work, though he got a start in radio drama in the 50s. And when we get together and talk, we hardly ever talk about television. We'll always talk about radio. It's quite amazing, actually. And these are two people who've had most of their kind of careers spent in television. The other thing I'd probably offer as an example of this is sports commentary. Say in the Olympics or the AFL. I don't pretend to be a sports commentator's bootlace. But I first worked with the Seven Network's iconic Bruce McAvaney. We first met each other 45 years ago at Radio 5DN in Adelaide.
Wow.
Bruce is one of the great voices of sport. Yet, for the vast majority of time, in his commentary at least, you never see him. And yet who would doubt the power and that iconic sound of Bruce McAvaney's voice that we've all known for decades, with him calling AFL matches, or his unforgettable calling of Kathy Freeman's gold medal in the year 2000 Olympics. So there's power in that voice, and I think in all of our voices, to create kind of great impact or great memories.
Yeah, and when I think of voice and in your particular industry, I think of people like yourself, like Bruce, like Roger, and the great Hendo. Brian Henderson.
Yep, totally.
They're the voices that immediately come to mind without me having to think about anything.
Yeah. Some of this, I think it's especially the case with some of the commentators. I'm going to explain why I think this is the case in a moment. But with especially some of the commentators, it's curious to me that their voice, Ray Warren in rugby league, Dennis Cometti in AFL, this is, you hear them and it just all comes back. And yet you hardly ever see them. And I think that there are reasons why that impact is so significant.
Yeah. Yeah, so how crucial is the voice in any form of communication?
Yeah, as I said, I've done a lot of thinking about this. I think it's absolutely critical. Best illustrated, perhaps, I remembered a podcast interview that I did probably about 5 years ago with an early learning educator at a private school. And she said something that really stuck with me, that the best way to teach young kids, and I actually think that this applies to all ages, is to fire up their imagination. So here's a person like me who's worked in both radio and TV. So TV, if you're a consumer, it gives you this big dump on the visual sense and the audio sense. And I think I often sit there in the lounge room watching television like a bit of a zombie. But with radio and the voice, it's only tapping into one sense. So the listener, I think there's a good argument to say the listener is actually more focused and their imagination is fired up. They don't get everything. They just get this voice. So they're left to think, who is this person? What do they look like? And I think crucially, when you use a voiceover artist, say in a commercial or a narration, they're asking, what is it that they are trying to say to me? And I think you have a much greater attention of that kind of listener than you will as a zombie viewer for watching television.
Yeah, I find I listen a lot better than watching. There's something about as you say, with the senses, the five senses. Even though I'm kinesthetic, I like to feel things, and I always communicate kinesthetically.
Yeah.
I still find that when I'm sitting in front of a television or even a screen like this, I tend to zombify out.
Yes.
And just stare at a screen. But when I've actually got to communicate or use the two things on the side of my head, I find I pay a lot more attention.
Yeah. So again, as a news guy who's worked primarily in television, but also for radio, if there's a big story on, I can remember the last big story that I actually turned the television on for. That was the January 6th invasion of the Capitol building. And the one before that was the Japanese earthquake, I don't know, probably a decade ago. And for me, I think because I have a greater understanding of how much more you will get on radio than you do on television, because you've got to have the pictures, I'll always turn the radio on. Most of the time, turn the radio on and get the breaking news from there.
Yeah. So we're talking a lot about voiceover. So what is a voiceover artist exactly? Could you elaborate on that for us, Leigh?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'd probably define it just simply as a voice for hire for a particular form of communication, usually for ads. I think voiceover artists are primarily thought of for ads, but I'd also extend it to narration for a documentary and other kind of things like that. It is the voice for in an ad or a documentary narration, I think, is a hugely important mood setter. In fact, in any context, like in any conversation like we're having, or again in meetings, but in media, I actually think it can be the defining difference between the success of a particular form of communication, whatever that is, be it narration or an ad, between the success of that and actually not hitting the mark.
Yeah. Just to prove the success of that, and I've actually done this, I would challenge some people, the listeners, to actually, next time you're watching TV, turn the sound off. Turn the sound off and then go and watch the same thing that you've just, like, pick an ad, for example, and watch that ad without the sound.
Yep.
Then go back and watch that ad with the sound.
Yep.
And it is a completely different, you get a completely different feel, completely different, brings up completely different emotions, completely different mindsets.
Yeah, totally.
When you've actually got the sound.
Yeah. I'll go one further. I'm musical. I could
Yeah.
turn the camera around and show you my various instruments
Yeah.
in my study here.
Mm.
And I often think, okay, if you're doing a comedy
Mm.
and you put music with that that's dramatic and symphonic, it's just so
Mm.
jarring. Likewise, if there's a murder mystery and you've got something like the old Benny Hill kind of music going along, it's so jarring. Music is
Mm.
incredibly powerful for setting
Yeah.
that kind of mood. And I think somewhat
Mm.
similarly with the voice. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So, how do I discern between a good voice, good voice, and a good voiceover artist, and one that's maybe not so great?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't want to bag any voiceover colleagues like I do it, and there are many
Yeah.
who do it as well. Um, but something happened to me in 1988, so that's
Mm.
35 years ago.
Yeah.
It was my first dip into the terrifying pool of being a live television newsreader with Channel 7. And a
Mm.
woman called Gina Boone and I were trained not by a news man or woman,
Mm.
not by the news director, not by a newsreader, but we were trained by a theatre director. And I thought, oh, that's a curious kind of choice. And he said lots of good things, which were really
Mm.
helpful. The thing that most struck me, and I've passed on to countless numbers of people I've mentored and coached, he said to us, it was a stage where the great kind of news reading stars were kind of starting to be replaced or subsequently or supported by working journalists. And I was one of them. So I was an on-the-road reporter for many years, had a lot of experience, and they started shipping us into the studio to read the news. And he said to the two of us, who were both journalists, he said, so I get it that you're a working journalist, you're on the road every day telling all these stories. So I get that when you're reading the news in the studio, you know what you're talking about. And we said, yeah, sure, sure. And he said, well, I want you to read with understanding. Those three words, I think, change everything in a whole lot of contexts of voice presentation. In other words, let what you say, the words that you're saying, determine how you're going to say it. It's how we actually all usually speak. But when you're doing it formally in voiceover work or presenting on camera or reading scripts, it's not a very common thing that you'll get people who will genuinely get that sense
Mm.
of reading with understanding. Let what you say determine how you're going to say it. So you have to choose a bit carefully, I think, when you dip into the world of voiceover
Mm.
artists to truly nail that. But once you do, it changes everything.
Yeah. And it really, even just in the art, just to sidetrack a bit, just in the art of everyday communication,
Yeah,
that sort of makes you stop to think, okay, what am I saying? How is it landing for the other person?
yep, yep. I say to
Mm.
people,
Yeah.
the insights I'm offering you on voice work in presentation
Mm.
skills workshops that I do will cross every kind of barrier. Whether it is in meetings, whether it's a one-on-one meeting, whether you're an MC or
Mm.
doing any kind of work or any kind of conversation, if you can truly get that, it really has the potential to change everything.
Mm. Yeah. Yeah. So how can this podcast is actually going out to, as I've mentioned, NDIS
Yeah,
providers specifically. They're the main listeners of this podcast.
do a great
How
work.
can they use a voiceover artist?
Yeah, I think that's a really helpful question. I think you need to pick a voice for a particular form of communication, considering, okay, what's the end result here? And who's the audience? That is the question that I ask every client who commission me to
Mm.
produce, direct, or present a video. That's what I do. I do those for clients.
Right.
My first question is,
Mm.
who's your audience? I don't ask them what their goals are,
Yeah.
what their framework or what their aims and objectives are.
Mm.
I leave that as a secondary consideration, not because I'm trying to rip them
Yes.
off, but because
No.
when you get the audience sorted
Mm.
out, again, that changes everything as well. So is it for an aged care audience or a kindergarten
Yeah.
audience? Is it
Yeah.
for a group of high-powered, executives? Is it for politicians, or is it for
Mm.
teachers? So that first question
Exactly.
changes everything,
Mm.
and it also really will
Mm.
influence your choice of a voice. And then you need to
Mm.
ask, okay, so is it for an ad, like
Mm.
on radio or on television? Is it for a documentary, or the narration of a story, or a podcast? Is it a voice that I'm choosing to be a podcast interviewer or a podcast interviewee? Again, you'll use different voices for different contexts, and without kind of
Yeah.
keeping on banging the drum, I think the biggest test will be, can I get someone to nail that reading with understanding thing?
Yeah.
Because that's the way to break through. If you listen, and I think I'll probably say this at some stage. When you're
Mm.
choosing a voice, you need someone who's able to break through. The listener has
Mm.
one chance of getting it. The listener's probably in the midst of all sorts of distractions, and that's
Mm.
another kind of measure that I think will help
Mm.
in the choice of a
Mm.
voice. What's going to
Yeah.
break through?
Mm. I love there how you mentioned that the starting point is knowing. I think you said knowing who your audience is,
You know that?
and
Yep.
with the NDIS providers, it's one of the biggest struggles I have. When I initially meet with a provider, I say to them, right, who's your target? Where have you come from as a business? Where are you, and where do you want to get to?
Yeah, yeah,
Why I take them through those three questions is because I ask them, who is your target audience?
yep. Totally. It changes
And
everything.
nine times out of 10, they sit there and they go, what's a target market?
Yeah.
What's a
But
target
but
audience? They have no clue.
it's an absolutely
Mm.
critical thing. I mean, the
Yeah.
video I would produce for an aged care cohort is
Mm.
utterly different from a kindergarten cohort or a high-powered political or corporate kind of.
Exactly.
It does
Yeah.
change everything. Yeah.
Mm. And it changes your voice, tone of
Yeah.
voice,
Absolutely. Yes.
inflections,
Yeah.
everything.
Yeah.
Mm. So, what are some of the things that I'd need to ask, or our listeners would need to ask if they're seriously considering a voiceover artist when they're
Yeah.
trying to select the right one for them?
Okay. Good question. I'd probably ask, okay, what is the sound I want? They probably haven't thought about that as with the audience,
Mm.
but what's my message? Is it for comedy?
Mm.
Is it for a crime podcast? Again, is it an ad for aged care or childcare? Is it an ad for a
Mm.
funeral home,
Yeah.
or a big cruise liner? Like, they're
Yeah.
all so different, and you need to be sure that the voice you select can cover all of those really different bases, or to be sure
Yeah.
that if you want one particular
Mm.
base covered, that person
Mm.
really can connect
Mm.
with that. Again, in the whole reading with understanding, let what you say
Mm.
determine how you say it. In
Mm.
thinking about this, I also would add this. I think empathy is one of the most important skills of a voiceover artist, or I think any performer on television or radio. That a person with empathy is able to, and they need to, kind of immerse themselves into the message or the
Mm.
product or the podcast or the subject matter of
Yeah.
the narration. And as I said before,
Mm.
I also think to choose and ask these kind of maybe challenging questions. Is this person going to be able to speak one-on-one with the listener or the viewer?
Mm.
So you may be reading an ad for a top-rating radio program with hundreds of thousands of listeners, or a documentary on television, or in the movies
Mm.
for millions of viewers. But I always think, and I tweet to this as a television newsreader, I'm
Mm.
always speaking on television to maybe, please God, a vast audience, but every person viewing that is only ever receiving it as a one-on-one conversation. So that's the tone that you need to adopt. And any voice, I think, whether you're doing an ad or a documentary narration or anything like that, has that person got that ability to speak as if they're speaking one-on-one with the listener? I think that changes everything as well. So that voiceover artist has to be able to do that. And again, you may need to kind of consider that, be careful, be discerning when you dip into the world of the voiceover artist to find that kind of magic, you know?
Yeah. I've done a bit of public speaking as well, and it's exactly the same when you're in front of a live crowd.
Yeah.
Is being able, although there's 100 people in the room, it's being able to have that one-on-one conversation with one person in that room, but with 100 individuals, and having that individual conversation with 100 different people.
Yeah, it's a challenging thing for a client to hear, because I always say to them, you know, set aside for a moment your aims and objectives. Who's your audience? And I'm sure they scratch their heads and they say, hang on, I'm hiring you to look after me. And I think, no, I'll look after you.
No.
But the first thing you need to understand is who's the audience. It's not, frankly, to be brutal, it's not about you. It's about the audience and your ability to connect a message with them. If they get that, that's a very significant thing.
Every single person I speak to, I have that exact conversation.
Yeah.
As you know, I come from a telemarketing background, and the reason that I've branched out into marketing consulting is purely because of that thing alone.
Yeah.
Is that they're people, and especially in the NDIS space, they all think it's about them. It's about me. And I'm like, no, it's about who are you trying to attract?
Yeah. We can make it about you.
Speaking there.
Yeah.
Sorry?
No, we can make it about you, and we will. But the first thing that you need to really nail is, okay, so who is your audience? What are you hoping to say?
Exactly.
Yeah.
So where do I find the right voiceover artist for my particular project or brand?
Yeah. Well, of course, there are voiceover agencies you can look up. They offer on their website samples of the voices that they have in their stables. You could listen carefully and purposefully to, say, a popular commercial radio program, and if there's a voice that stands out to you, you know, they run minutes and minutes and minutes of ads and voices each hour. So if there's a voice that stands out to you, you could ring up the sales department of that station, and they'd know who the voice of a person is. Ask who it is. When I watch a documentary, I must confess I'm such a sad person. I always hang around for the credits to the end, especially if it's a really good voice. And I think, I wonder who that is. That's how sad I am. I'm always interested to hang on to the credits to see who that is. And you could do that as well and look up that person. You know, they're probably with an ad agency or probably, like me, are in the freelance kind of voiceover business.
Yeah, right. Yeah, and there are a number of voiceover companies as well out there that, I think if you just Google voiceover, I know there's a couple in the city in Sydney. For our listeners in Sydney, and so there's numerous ways in which you can find a voiceover artist. But now that we've found the right artist for our project, what are they going to say? How do I write the script for that particular voiceover artist?
Yeah, that is a critical question, and here's where I think there may sometimes be a tussle between the marketer or the voiceover guy and the client, who wants to say as much as they can in a short period of time. The first bit of advice I'd say is write tight. I learned from the very start of my career in radio that you're writing for someone. I mentioned this before. You're writing for someone who mostly has just one chance of getting your message, often in the midst of distractions. So they might be, 50% listening, maybe at best. So you need to write simply, and you need to write it tight. You're actually writing for the ear. So you're not writing Shakespeare in this kind of context. So I think one of the kind of skills is to not overwrite. I often do ads where I think, I'd love to slash, it's a 30-second ad, but I'd love to
Yeah.
slash 10 seconds off this so
Mm.
I can really give it my best reading with understanding kind of presentation instead of trying to gallop through all these words and, try and catch your breath here, there, and everywhere, and then it's all that. So
Yeah.
I think one of the great skills, it's a challenge for a client because they'll want to say more than they probably can or than is wise. But if you really want to get your message through to the audience, and that's what it's all about, don't overwrite. Give the script time to breathe. The full stop is your best friend. That's the other thing I'd say. Keep lots of short, punchy sentences. So in a 30-second ad, it can't be one sentence where you don't give the poor voiceover artist any kind of chance to breathe. Yeah, full stop is your best friend. Lots of short, punchy sentences. And always remember, as I said, the audience most of the time has just one chance to get it.
Yeah. Oh, that's succinct and direct.
Yes. Yeah.
Is what I'm thinking. As I hear you say that, I'm thinking succinct and direct.
Yep. Too right. Too right.
Yeah. And but listeners out there that are thinking 30 seconds, it's not much time.
No, it's not.
Which really it isn't to communicate a message.
Yeah.
But you try and sit there and do nothing for 30 seconds and see how long it is.
Yeah.
It is actually a long time.
Yeah, it is. Yeah. But the art is to have a bit of discipline and just a bit of a bigger picture to say, okay, is this all about me cramming as much as I can into this 30 seconds? Or do I really want to hit the target of my audience? And I think if you do the second, full stop's your best friend, lots of short, punchy sentences, and give it time to breathe. Give them time to actually listen rather than this gabble of words. Yeah.
Yeah. Great. Well, this has been great, Leigh. Very, very informative, and I'm sure our listeners have really enjoyed hearing about your background as well, and your experience in the industry of journalism and media in general.
Good on you.
In wrapping up, is there anything else that you think would be useful for NDIS providers in particular when it comes to using voiceover?
Yeah, I think that's important. Yeah, who's our audience? I mean, I've kept them in my mind all through this conversation for exactly the reason that I've been talking about. I'd probably get back to the question of empathy, especially in the NDIS sector. Empathy and that notion of reading with understanding, like especially in the disability sector, considering, who's the audience, considering the makeup of that sector, who they are and where they are. You, especially there, absolutely need that empathy. We're not selling grog, or we're not selling beans, or makeup or cars or anything. We're selling it to a very specific audience that is that does great work and meets a lot of needs. So I think you do have to be empathetic in tone. I'd also say this though, probably to any voiceover, unless it's really going off the charts. Don't overdo it, or don't act it. It's got to be sincere. It's got to be a voice that can actually do empathy rather than act it. And there is a big difference from the two of those. And listeners are not dumb. They'll pick that. Yeah. So it's probably not for the kind of arena. It's not probably the kind of arena for some of those big booming voices we all hear about on radio. But someone who can be genuinely and thoughtfully authentic to immerse themselves into that message, that immersion thing, with both authenticity and empathy. Yeah, I'd probably leave it at that.
Yes. So I wouldn't get a sports presenter, for example, to do a voiceover.
No.
I wouldn't get. I know you mentioned rabbits earlier.
Yeah.
Ray Warren. I wouldn't get him to do a voiceover for an NDIS provider.
Yeah. Who knows? He might be able
to.
Who knows? He might be able to be flexible. But I think that is it's not something you can act, or it's and it's very easy to overdone it.
Yeah. And that's kind of why I laboured on the point when you brought it up earlier about empathy.
Yeah.
Because it's something that a lot of providers tend to miss.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's one of the things, just to get off topic for a little bit, but it's one of those things where, a lot of providers, they don't even understand that.
No.
The whole empathy thing.
Yeah.
The industry grew from, I probably had enough fingers to count how many providers in Western Sydney, pre-NDIS, to over the last 10 years, we now have over 3,500 in Sydney.
Wow. Yeah. It's a
And
big
that is
story at the
because,
moment, isn't it?
yeah, and a lot of them have just in it for the money, or in it because they think they know how to provide a particular service.
Yes.
But they miss that point of it has to be done with empathy.
Yep. Again, who's your audience?
Yeah,
who are you caring for?
Exactly. So if your ads and your voiceover is not presented with that empathy,
Yeah.
they're not going to come to you in the first place.
No.
But then you need to be able to follow through on that. Once
Yep.
they've actually come to you, you've shown them empathy through your voiceover
Yep.
and through your ads. And that's why they've come to you. If they're not actually getting that empathy through the whole entire process of working with you, they're not going to stay with you very long.
No, especially in this sector. I'm not a used car sales guy wanting to flog cars on Parramatta Road in Sydney. I'm not selling holidays on cruise liners. There's a very significant and very much needed arena of our national life now post NDIS, one that's meeting a lot of needs and caring for a lot of people in doing it pretty tough. So it's got to have that empathy.
Yeah. That's a whole different podcast, but there's also the other side of that coin where it's not meeting that need. It's one of the reasons why I do what I do and why I started this podcast. To try and change that perception.
Yeah. One of the things I say to my clients as I media train them, I'm honest to say, look, no amount of media training will fix a dud product personal performance. So fix it before it gets to the media. I'm not saying that NDIS providers are duds, but you've got to be able to actually do this work well, and no amount of marketing or voice work or anything like that will cover up for a job not well done.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. And that's what I alluded to earlier, was that a good ad and a good voiceover might get the participants to come to you as the provider.
Yeah.
But if you don't care for their needs and look after their needs, they aren't going to stay with you long.
Totally.
And the words out of their mouth, although it's not in mass media, the words out of their mouth are far more powerful than mass media.
Yep. You would know, as I do, the most powerful form of advertising is word of mouth.
Exactly.
Which is probably a good way to wrap this conversation up, actually.
Yes.
With the voice.
Yeah. Sorry?
With the voice.
With the voice, exactly.
Yeah.
So, again, thank you for your time, Leigh.
Pleasure, Greg.
This has been very informative.
Thanks for having us.
Now, if any of our listeners want to know more about voiceover or about yourself and the kind of work that they can do with yourself, how can they get in contact with you?
I've got a website, Leigh Hatcher, LEIGHHATCHER, and there's a range of stuff that I do for clients on that. Yeah. Feel free to dip in.
Great.
Send us a message.
Great. Thanks, Leigh.
Thanks, Greg. All the best.
This has been great.
Good.
Thanks.
Bye.